Hello! So we're going to talk about the video that I just released about the electricity generating battery. Because I never really described how the light wave interactions for inside the battery work and what those actually do for not just separating compounds that go through, meaning inner air, pollutants, chemicals, all that. Which kind of acts like a filter, but bear with me. Just like I described for the fin array for the waste heat generator and the solar photovoltaic, it needs to have a pattern on the inside, like I started describing, that allows for it to help excite electron orbitals and then be captured. Now, that's easy enough actually to do. We have these little, we're going to now use them for time clocks or something. They puff up electron orbitals, and then the way they decay or some shit, they use them to count time. So as a result, that's effectively another version of what that is. And then the light itself dumps into becoming a optical tweezer or inertial confinement, like laser, the light pressure kind of thing, to specifically allow for specific combinations of elements and compounds that were not fully broken down. So, plant materials love carbon. Got that in abundance. But, you know, this thing called potassium and beryllium and all those, you know, they don't really like that. You know what they do like? Nitrogen. They love nitrogen. And, you know, this thing called hydrogen here, when it combines, it makes heat. And when I have oxygen that's separated and some hydrogen and some carbon, I make a version of an acetylene carbon methane blend, more or less, that burns. Very small amounts. I don't need much. And in fact, that also produces its own version of, if I separate them the correct way and correctly, because we're using light to more or less separate and charge fields in some compounds, you know, elements, to help facilitate this, meaning electron orbital interacting forces. So, now, as a result of that, I end up creating what is a slight recombination that breaks itself apart, that makes H2O and carbon that dumps off into the large amount of nitrogen that will just hang around because it can't really combine very easily. It can, but it's like, you know, it's a little bit more neutral. It's a little bit less reactive unless you have the right conditions to do it. Well, I do for the beginning of the intake area for the battery. Now, then I separate them from nitric oxides, which is great. But then I have that filtered thanks to, you know, that separation of multiple holes that effectively allow as a way of for pathways for oxygens, carbons, and so on to be separated. All right, this produces heat. That electricity goes back in. I already have a battery. I'm going to use that battery for a while. I have electricity coming from a very highly efficient solar panel and a waste heat generator. And then I'm also producing more heat by chemical exothermic reactions. So then I basically use the light and everything else that it amplifies, because more or less I'm going to have some light amplifying layers. And then those are also compounds that can help with filtration of these different compounds, because they also help with charge fields and electromagnetics. Now, once you do that, you then have that nitrogen scrape off the charged carbon that is then going to go into a catch can. Okay, and then just like an oil catch can, that allows for it to stay there and be carbon. Okay, I'm not looking to make that carbon go back into the atmosphere. You don't have to do that, though. That makes it less energy efficient in terms of work motion energy or energy gained. I'm using energy from that carbon capture system because I have to make charges and I have to make photons, lasers, and all the rest of the filtration occur, which makes a degree of pressure now that I have to overcome to be able to do it. Now, as a result of this, I have managed to, while sure, maybe I was at 500 kilowatts, now maybe 300, something along those lines. Granted, it's probably not 200 kilowatts. If I'm being really honest, it's probably not. It's already in a state where it wants to be like that. And so it's fairly efficient at remaining like that. I just have to really, do it the right way. And then I have carbon and a catch can that is basically a single atom carbon that will eventually become like a bunch of graphite, most likely, some graphene and all the rest of it that comes in, and then it flows with a degree of neutrality element, meaning gaseous element that is nitrogen or atmosphere. It might still react a little bit, but it's very little. There is still going to be carbon that comes out. I can't fully get rid of it, but significantly, I removed a good amount, probably in the 90% range, I would imagine, because we already have a version like that is in the 90% range, and I just don't know where I fucking saw that. But the point is like we do have that, and then we also happen to have the rest of the light, which happens to sort oxygens into hydrogens, which were already pretty much there. There was a bunch of H2O already there. And then oxygens, should there be any remainder of H, they'll be there for that. And we capture that with a basic waste heat generator radiator. The separate version, like it cools it over here. This one is more of a Stirling that is going to make that energy get dissipated and captured into that cooling. So a degree of this is getting cooled by that, and then that's hotter, hopefully because of all this other stuff that's happening, than that, which creates a thermosiphon effect, which is what we're looking for. It also allows for the reaction profiles to be even better because now we have the ability to use that light diffusal process and the air curating, directing, and management process that allows for us to combine oxygens and hydrogens. Nitrogens remain free for the most part. Can't completely get rid of it, but also same thing with carbon, where carbon also gets captured. You could burn that if you wanted. I'm not going to, but carbon is burnable. You can spray it with the nitrogen into your cylinder with a direct injection, like a diesel injector or something, under high pressure, and it would probably burn. I don't know why you would do that, but okay, I already have a very efficient engine, battery, capacitor, MOS, or field of with piezoelectrics, and there's a lot that's going on there for that battery. Okay, like that's how the process works for plus that light also helps create its own version of separation between cathode anode, meaning it has less here, more there. And it acts like its own, which how much smaller can you get than light? You know what I mean? For like the insulator, So that's kind of good. It still has the other compounds and everything else that are insulative, and reflective and amplifying and so on. But again, light tends to help manage some of those field effects by oscillating them. Okay, so it'll do it without any air going through, and it'll still be a battery, and it'll still work as a battery. But the moment you get any kind of air going through, then you create a greater degree of potentiation, because it still creates light. It'll still effectively have a photonic release as a result of electron orbital movement, which then gets captured, and it does this process. Now, if it didn't do that, it would still be a battery. But like as a result of that, the light going through, which you have to be really knowledgeable in what that means. So as a result of polarization and as a result of the field effect that polarized light creates, it makes a degree of interference forces within a electromagnetic effect for the field effect and the whatever conductive wire you're choosing to use. Mine happens to use basically just carbon. I figured like piezoelectrics are pretty known to work together with carbon. I figured there's pretty ubiquitous. Steel will still work. You know what I mean? It combines. I didn't really add that in. Granted, I have phosphorus, potassium, and everything else, which is like those are nanowires essentially that can handle like really large amps of currents once the field effect gets. In fact, even before the field effect happens. So, it's one of those catch-22s where it's like I don't necessarily need copper. And the way I allow for it to jiggle, wiggle, and drop like a capacitor forward and backwards and everything creates a version of current that exits on any part of it that you want to connect to, on the outside. Typically, I run it to the outside because that's easier to do than trying to route a bunch of little tiny freaking cables through all of it. And then it pulses the right way, and it spreads out, it goes to that outer ring, and then it's kind of like a brushed design, contact area, which allows for, whatever to be added to it. I typically just plug in whatever I need, and then I insulate the rest of it, and then it'll drop and dump into there. And so flow current is different than DC or AC. It's a sine wave with another sine wave that also has a tertiary sine, like a three-phase. But the tertiary is actually just a wiggle jiggle that holds the two bits of information, more or less, meaning wiggles and jiggles. And so like I was talking about at the end there, those wiggles and jiggles in the sine wave that balance off of the tertiary that's some good old smoked sausages. Anyways, those happen to be those sine waves and everything able to create with an opposing, which you don't really necessarily need because of those jiggles and wiggles, how they cross-talk effectively. Interference is apparently what the word is, which I'm like, whatever. Interference. It's not interfering it from doing its thing. It's still light. It's just combining, which is interacting. I don't understand that. Why did they call it that? That's stupid. Anyways, moving on. The interaction profile is such that it creates a basic shit. I was just thinking about this as I was riding my bike. That damn interference thing, it bothers me. I'm like, they don't call it interaction. It's interaction. Why don't they call it interaction? Hey, can you focus, camera? There we go. It's an interaction. There's an interaction profile. It's not an interference. It's not stopping it from doing it. Anyways, It's so stupid. It's so annoying, actually. Like, anyways, the fields create the electron flow. The, of course, fluid that has to travel through is also going to help that flow, but also create what is essentially another version of a catalyst, but not just a catalyst. It actually helps with this thing called creation of more electrons, thanks to the field effects of dumping into that effect. So it's a lot of electrons being created as it goes through. The light also does help excite and then dump and then create its own version of kinetic, but then that kinetic also creates its own version of movement, of course, which creates a piezoelectric, which then creates more electrons, and it has a cascading pulsing effect. Now, those wiggles and jiggles and the sine wave then can have an opposite, which in its own right is one side, other side, top, bottom, middle, out approach, creating a pulsing effect that creates its own version of not interference, it's chirality now, that then creates a top layer, a middle layer, and a in-between that creates a effectively very easy, low-resistant field effect through a wire with those sine waves carrying even greater degrees of energy than before, with a wiggle and a sine wave, then a jiggle that interacts with a wiggle that is actually using a jiggle to carry information for, like, you know, electricity amounts. So like a large amount of electricity can flow through this shit. Which I know it's like not electric, that's current, amps, volts. And I'm like, it's electrons. I don't care. Electricity amounts, whatever. Now, granted, it also carries information. That's what I use for my design for changing programming for a quantum programming, quasi-quantum programming, sine wave change that is flow current both ways for regular transistors, which they will work this way. And some of them will allow you to go backward. In fact, all of them actually allow you to go backwards and forwards. Turns out I had to look into that a little bit, but they do pretty darn well, especially when set up appropriately and improperly with those sine waves, jiggles, and wiggles, which allows for you to calculate both ways. And if you set it up with the right timing, you have increased clock rate basically 4 times, even though the sine wave is another one. You have to look into it. Please look into that. That's further into some of the other things. In fact, I added Vertasium about that a while back, and nobody ever listened or even watched it. Anyways, toodles. Bye. Yeah.